And with that, we will begin the lectures, which means I now have to introduce myself. So, I'm Brian. Some of you may already know that. And today I'm going to talk to you about the use of horse skulls in magic, particularly with relevance to the protection of buildings. This is work in progress. This is me developing an element of work that's in my book, if you've seen that. So I will welcome any tips or advice or knowledge that any of you may have at the end of this as well. So, as I'm sure many of you are already aware, there have been many discoveries of horse skulls beneath the floors of buildings and also quite a few in the roofs of buildings. And this seems to be part of the practice of protecting buildings and their occupants from evil. The practice has very long roots with horses and burials, but in its current form of just the horse skull beneath the floor or in a roof space, we're looking at a practice that dates back to about the 14th century. That was the monster there, I don't know if you've heard anything about that. So we're looking at a practice that seems to date back to about the 14th century. Excuse me. But we have also good testimony about the practice from the late 19th century. The horse also features in various folk traditions, as I'm sure you know, like the Mary Lwyd from Wales. And in this paper, I'll try to summarise the evidence so far and inject some of my own thoughts along the way. So, I'll just put a picture of a horse skull up for you. This is Herbert. This is my horse skull. He was already dead when I bought him, just in case you're wondering. I got him from an antique store, and he sits at the top of one of my bookshelves. So when I'm sitting there emailing away and stuff, I can glance around, give Herbert a little wave, and carry on. So investigation into the meaning of horse skulls, in terms of academic research, before I started looking at it, has been limited to two main explanations. There's the acoustic theory, the idea that it assists acoustics somehow in a building or a church. And there's also the foundation sacrifice theory. I think that the real answer is probably a bit less binary than those two choices, and also that there are other beliefs at play related to the nature of the horse as well. As far as I know, there has been little research into whether concealing horse skulls beneath the floor does actually improve the quality of the sound. And as you can imagine, it's quite a difficult thing to set up to test. But I would say that I am a musician as well, and I would often play next to Herbert, and no difference at all. No difference at all. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that definitely is proof, but one day we need to get a floor, screw some horse skulls to the bottom of it, and give it a proper test. But so far, the evidence is more sort of oral, and I think it's probably more to do with the fact that if you're walking along ready to conceal some horse skulls in your house with a pair of them under each arm, and you spot your neighbouring priest or vicar, what are you up to there, man? Oh, well, I was trying to improve the acoustics, actually, in my house. It doesn't seem terribly plausible to me. But it is a reason that is often given, as you'll see in a moment. So, in England, I have on my own files at least 54 examples of concealed horse skulls and animal bones which have been reported from under buildings. One of the most famous examples is actually in Ralph Merrifield's book, which is the example from Portsway Inn in Staunton-on-Wye in Herefordshire, where they found 24 horse skulls screwed to the underside of the pub floor. And the explanation there was that it was to make the fiddle go better. That's what everybody believed the reason was. In Herefordshire, there have been many more horse skulls found. There's another building not that far away in Peterchurch, which had a similar number found beneath the floor of a hall there as well. And then we also have examples like this one in Elsdon Church in Northumberland, in a box in a chamber above the belfry, above the little bell turrets. They found these 3 horse skulls there, and certainly locally they've attempted to explain the presence of the horse skulls, meaning that maybe it would enhance the sound of the bells, but also you could look at it as one of the early functions of bells was to sort of scare away evil spirits before coming to prayer. So maybe the horse skulls were performing that function as well. Certainly in that case, people are divided between those two ideas, it seems. But in England, one of the best examples we have was actually quoted in Enid Porter's Cambridgeshire Customs and Folklore, 1969. And in that book, the author cites a builder's practice with horse skulls, which I'm just going to read in full because it's really important. So, the author says, W.H. Barrett recalls that his uncle, a builder, secured the contract in 1897 for erecting a primitive Methodist chapel at Black Horse Drove. One day he sent his nephew, then aged 6, with his elder brother to the knacker's yard to buy a horse's head. When the two boys returned with it, they watched the workmen dig the trench for the foundations and then saw their uncle carefully mark the centre of the site by driving into the ground a wooden stake. The men then gathered round while the uncle uncorked a bottle of beer. Then the horse's head was placed in the bottom of the trench, the first glass of liquor poured from the bottle was thrown onto the horse's head, and then when the rest of the beer had been drunk, the men shovelled bricks and mortar on top of the head, and it was explained to W.H. Barrett that this was an old heathen custom to drive evil and witchcraft away. So we've got 1897, a very clear example of builders believing firmly that putting a horse's head in the foundations, pouring a libation of beer over it before then covering it over was a fairly normal practice to them. And this is on the site of a chapel, and that they firmly believed that it was warding off evil. I think that's really interesting, because many other authors think it's foundation sacrifice, which could be appeasing a genius loci or a spirit of place. Yet here we've got builders saying it's to drive away evil. And there's nothing here about acoustics either, is there? Right, now we also have lots of examples of horse skulls from Wales. This is an example from a paper by Euron William, who did a big study of horse skulls in Wales in 2000. And he was of the opinion that protection against evil was the main purpose of horse skulls, but he thought that the practice originated as foundation sacrifice, but came to be thought of as protection against evil, which is, that's his point of view. But he also cites some really interesting examples. So there's a chapel at a place called Breckford in Breconshire, where several horse skulls were found in the ceiling. And another example of a Calvinist chapel, which I think was built in 1827, which has 4 horse skulls buried in the foundations. It's interesting that there's 4, because it might be that, I'm going to quote a Swedish example in a bit, where sometimes you get horse skulls buried at the corners of the building. And then he also states that at Llandaff Cathedral, horse skulls were found embedded in the choir stalls as well in the 1930s. And then there's also a load of examples from Ireland as well. This is actually 14th century, this particular example, from Portmarnock. Portmarnock isn't very far away from Dublin. In Ireland, I would say that the main paper on concealed horse skulls is by someone called Sean O'Sullivan, who wrote his paper in 1945. He was a member of the Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, and he managed to persuade lots of members of the Society of Antiquaries of Ireland to go out and survey on his behalf about horse skulls in Ireland, because they'd found some horse skulls beneath the stone in front of the fireplace in Ireland, and they wanted to see how widespread that practice was. So in this survey, they were asking people, have you ever seen a horse skull underneath the flagstone in your fireplace? And basically they found lots and lots of examples. There is 50 plus examples in their survey. And certainly in Ireland, the reason it was given most often was that they thought it made the dancing sound better when people were dancing before the fire in the evenings. Again, it's a little bit different to the fiddle, but it's still very similar. But Sean O'Sullivan, he was convinced that the practice must have earlier origins and that the horse skulls were concealed as foundation sacrifices. He actually finishes his paper saying, "It can hardly be doubted that the now popular explanation of the burial of horse skulls under the floors of houses, churches, castles or bridges to produce an echo is a secondary one. It may be a practical explanation, but a little consideration of the problem must inevitably lead to the conclusion that this custom is but another link in the chain of evidence regarding the foundation sacrifices." So that's the second scholar who's heard acoustic theories but come down on the foundation sacrifice theory. In Scandinavia, there are lots of examples. There are loads in Sweden and in Finland. For those, we have to thank Albert Sandcliffe from Sweden and friend of the Hidden Charms conferences, Sonja Hukan-Taival, who some of you met in Salisbury and before in Norwich. So Swedish researcher Albert Sandcliffe in 1949, his work on horse skulls was more convinced by the acoustic explanation. Basically, when he surveyed, he was looking particularly at threshing barns, and what he was hearing from farmers was that the horse skulls under the threshing barns helped enhance the sound of the flails, and that led him to believe that maybe it was trying to make yourself sound busier or more wealthy than your neighbouring farms. But he did, despite accepting those explanations, he did accept that there may be traces of ancient practices at play. And another case from Sweden, a small village called Fru Alsted. There's an example of a house where, when they excavated, there were 4 horse skulls at each point underneath the house, and they were set into the earth, so they couldn't have been for acoustic reasons. So there is this parallel tradition in Sweden. They've got the threshing barns being investigated for acoustic properties, but then also we've got these other ones that couldn't be used for acoustics under houses. Another colleague told me about in the Ethnographic Museum in St. Petersburg in Russia. They have a tableau erected there of a horse skull next to some beehives, and the explanation given is that the horse skull was traditionally placed next to beehives to protect them from pests, but I guess it's to protect them from any kind of evil really as well. And another former speaker for Hidden Charms, Adina Hulabash, who some of you will remember from Salisbury as well. She's a member of the Romanian Academy, and she told me that in Romania horse skulls are placed in orchards to ward off evil as well. In the USA, there are examples from Illinois, Massachusetts and New Hampshire. For example, 4 horse skulls were found in the Jarrett Mansion at the Cahokia Courthouse Historic State Site. One of those was found in a cavity right next to the fireplace, and the others were found under the floor. It's interesting, that one, because the museum worker who told me about that discovery told me that I wasn't allowed to tell anybody else about them because the curator was so terrified of what the opinion that might form about that site. They thought that the idea that magic had taken place there would harm the reputation of their site. I've been reassured that person has now moved on, so I'm free to tell you about it. And at Goffstown in New Hampshire, a horse skull was found with some old shoes underneath the back of an old shop. And the owner was convinced that the horse skull had protected his store from several fires, which had affected his property and the neighbourhood in America there. And another example from South Deerfield in Massachusetts, at the Bryant Homestead, which was built in 1776. A horse skull was discovered in a thick wall near the chimney, and the finders found a piece of paper rolled in one of the eye sockets. And on it was written, Colonel David M. Bryant and family took possession of this farm on April the 29th, 1848. The note then lists the names of his wife and 6 children, and it seems to indicate that there was a charm of protection there to protect those names in that piece of paper. And when we're thinking about horse skulls and what they might be used for, we should also consider the qualities of the horse. They have a benevolent role in human life, and they could be seen as a friend of humans, and they could be seen as a protector as well, maybe in death. Another thing that I always thought was quite intriguing is that horse skulls are capable of sleeping are capable of sleeping standing up, and they're also capable of sleeping with their eyes open. They don't always choose to do that, but that also makes you think they might have a reputation as being highly vigilant as well, and they are very sensitive creatures as well. Obviously, the horse occurs in earlier examples of history and archaeology. The horse figures in prehistoric symbolism on coins, in assemblages of bones, sometimes mixed with human bones. There are mythological associations where horses are thought to pull the chariot of the sun god up to make the sun rise and the sun set as well. And of course, the daisy wheel, which many of us also study, is also associated with the sun in ancient law. And all of this leads some scholars to the conclusion that there was a cult of the horse and an associated horse queen in some of these cults. This horse queen could have had associations with fertility and also associations with royalty and death, passage to the other side. The analysis shows that numerous examples of horse burials in northwestern Europe of the more ancient variety served a variety of functions, from status symbol engraved goods, sacrifice to gods or ancestors, and a means of posthumous transportation to the other world. And there are examples of complete horse burials in England dating from the 8th and 9th centuries. And then, as I say, archaeologically speaking, we seem to have a bit of a leap then to this later practice of just the horse skull in the 14th century. So the horse skull also obviously appears in folk dance as well, and guising as well. And there is a quote from the 7th century St Aldhelm, who was abbot of Malmesbury, down in Wiltshire, or is it Somerset? Somerset, probably, from Malmesbury, isn't it? And anyway, he apparently castigated people in Wessex who would run about in the shape of beasts. And the quote says, "Long ago, horses and stags were worshipped in temples in crude stupidity among the impious." So in other words, masking and dressing as animals was quite common at that time. I'm sure you can tell from some of the pictures we've seen that a defleshed horse skull is actually a really fearsome looking thing, as evidenced in their inclusion in these practices. We have things like the Mary Lwyd and the Hudden horse from down in Kent. I'll show you some pictures of those. So this is a modern Mary Lwyd. This is John and Susan Exton, who live in Monmouth. They're both former art lecturers, and they're really into paganism and the occult and everything. And they love creating these and taking them out to wassails and in various parades. That's the same one for another view. They're lovely people, and they also have a black one as well. And these parade quite regularly in South Wales and into sort of Herefordshire and the borders down there. That's the same one again. And then here also, this is a picture thanks to Rob Gandy, who's in the audience today. We did an article for the 14 Times some time ago about this. This is showing one that's from around here, a Cheshire example. And then we also have the Hood and Horse, which I've basically stolen from Percy Malam's book here, but I have credited him, so hopefully that's okay. Okay, but you can see that here we've got more of like a simulation of the horse rather than an actual horse skull. But this is a very snappy horse, it's quite aggressive when it appears. And then, when you think of other things like the Abbots Bromley horn dance, those have been carbon dated now to being 1,000 years old. So definitely there is this tradition of animal disguised dances as well, which seems to be running along and informing, if you like, the use of the horse skulls beneath houses as well. So to conclude, because I've gone almost 1 minute over, which is quite shocking, I'm the organiser of this, Right, so horses are powerful and beautiful creatures, and their defleshed horse skulls have an intimidating and otherworldly quality. Horses figure strongly in folklore and mythology around the world, going way back, and they're often involved in the transit of the dead from this world to the next, and in some myths and legends, even for the rising and setting of the sun. It seems only natural that horses in their skull form sit as silently as guardians within buildings, protecting against supernatural threats. In the Mariluid and other folk dances, they periodically sweep into streets and houses, and they do actually the Mariluid does do some sweeping of the hearth as well, which could be significant for protection of the hearth, frightening away and sweeping away sources of supernatural harm. So in the early modern period and later, they certainly feature as one of the tools at people's disposal in the magical protection of buildings, but those practices appear to be descended from far earlier beliefs about horses. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.